Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy, with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun.
Kia ora, as Bernard would say, and I seldom do. Bernard's having a little bit of difficulty getting in, and we will bring him in shortly. He's in Greece, and he's just climbing to the top of a Greek island to see if he can get a little bit better coverage. So I'll wing it until he gets there. I think we're all pretty sure that I can do that. We've done it before. And we've got a good show for you today. I hope Bernard and I, when he comes on, we'll talk about some media stories that are happening in New Zealand. And on the show today, we've got Catherine Dyer, as usual, talking about, not to take her for granted, talking about climate reporting, and various other things, and whether the government, in fact, is serious about its climate targets, which sometimes I feel as though we talk about quite regularly, and I see no greater seriousness that they may actually be taking it seriously, taking the climate goals seriously, or doing what's necessary to abide it. In the international section, a little bit like we've done with the budget lately and last week with the International Criminal Court and a few other things, we're going to expand the international section, partly because we have not one. We have our usual marvellous Professor Robert Patman from Otago University, but we also have Professor Jamie Shea, who is a former spokesman for NATO and is now at Chatham House, will be joining us from, I think, Brussels. And we have Professor Teresa Dunworth, who is a professor of international law at Auckland University. I want to split it really between two subjects. I do actually keep a look at the comments on YouTube if you want to, but we'll probably start with Ukraine and this remarkable drone attack on the Russian heavy bombers and various other places, several thousand miles in many cases away from Ukraine. So we'll look at the audacity of that, the consequences of that, and what we know about it. And Jamie, as a former NATO person and a military analyst, is very good on that topic, and I know Robert will be interested in well. And in the second half of that international section, I would like to make about Gaza, and the decision overnight also of the Security Council. The United States vetoed the latest attempt to just order call for a ceasefire. So it wasn't condemning either side, but the United States again defended Israel in that, or stood up for Israel by boycotting that vote, preventing that vote going ahead. So we'd like to look at that. I know Professor Dunworth is particularly interested in the Gaza story and what it means for international law, and Jamie Shea has just written quite a substantial piece about the potential damage, or the damage that Israel is inflicting on itself as a diplomatic member of the international community. So that's what we're going to do. I don't think Simon, is Catherine on with us, or do I have to keep blurring? Oh, there she is. Excellent. He'll edit out the do I have to keep blurring. Catherine, it's really good to see you. It's interesting to a huge extent. Everybody always appreciates what you come up with each week, and the sort of the humour and solemnity. Because I think if you're right at the sort of leading edge of this, where the rest of us would be slitting our wrists by now.
You got to laugh, don't you?
Well, if you didn't laugh, you'd cry. I do cry sometimes. Yeah. So you wanted to talk about a few issues this week. Methane.
Yeah.
And whether the government is taking that seriously. Apparently, New Zealand's absolutely black. We got the best methane in the world, according to Christopher Luxon. And climate reporting as well. So what's the methane story, Catherine?
So the methane story is that there was a group of leading global climate scientists sent a letter to Mr. Luxon, Prime Minister Luxon, about the New Zealand's intentions to move towards a no no increased heating kind of approach to methane. So they sent him a letter kind of saying this is a really bad idea and providing all of the evidence for why it was a bad idea. And Luxon came back with a comment that they were a bunch of worthies, which is
the scientists were a bunch of worthies.
Yes,
yeah. That's reassuring, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to take that term worthies, except if you kind of reverse it and go, is that compared to the unworthies
yes.
that are setting our policy direction at the moment? And in that sense, it makes some sense. So it was. It's.
But he also said this thing. I'll challenge any country in the world to be as good on methane emissions as New Zealand. Is that a valid comparison? I mean, we say we've got the cleanest farming, which I don't really believe, but we say a lot. What's the truth of it?
If every country in the world had the amount of methane emissions per head of population that we do in Aotearoa, we would be in a serious amount of trouble. Methane is already responsible for something like
we're leading the world in global warming.
We literally are in terms of per person amounts. We are the highest emitters of agricultural methane in that sense. And so, if the rest of the world did what we did, we would all be in a serious amount of trouble. The problem with saying that we won't add any more to warming, it's kind of like saying that the amount that we're already adding is okay, is acceptable, when it clearly isn't. And it also sets up a situation where high methane emitters, high polluting countries like Aotearoa and Ireland, for instance, should be able to continue emitting at that level with no cease. But developing countries who want to kind of reduce their reliance on overseas imports, who want to develop their own agricultural system, wouldn't be able to do so, because they would be contributing to increasing the amount. So that's clearly unjust and unfair. And I think when you're going into it's basically.
Sorry, can I just do a headline from that?
Yeah.
Kiwi leaders unjust and unfair, says Catherine Dyer. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. You can quote me on it.
Good. No, I just think his comments, and also the stuff this week about the Resource Management Act and various other things about it being pro-farmer, is just such a sort of, it's appealing to a particular branch of society, which, and farmers are important in New Zealand, but it's this kind of close-mindedness to what the problem actually is, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's a kind of subsidy that we've been asked to pay for farmers, basically, in that we accept a reduction in water quality and in general climatic conditions in order for our farmers to be able to make a profit. And so there's trade-offs there, and you have to question whether they are governing for the whole of New Zealand and for all people, or for just the people who are making a profit and contributing to GDP growth. The other thing that's been interesting in line with that is I've seen at least 2 comments today online from people about the government treating experts and evidence as if
with
were,
disdain.
Absolute disdain, yeah. And those particular comments were in relation to the Deputy Prime Minister and the regulatory...
The new Deputy Prime Minister or the old Deputy Prime Minister?
The new
I suspect
Deputy.
It probably manages to both.
Well, it applies to both, but the latest one was about David Seymour and the new piece of... the new bill around the
resource management one. Yeah.
No, the regulatory...
the regulatory reduction bill, or whatever it's called.
Yeah. You know
the
what I mean.
RRB, which isn't what it's called.
Yeah, so he's got a habit of referring to everybody who disagrees with him as either a bureaucrat or a bot, as if there are not real humans out here.
Yes.
So, it's that kind of general disdain for evidence, for scientific advice, for experts, that is quite worrying, that is sort of building on top of each other. In fact, all 3 leaders of the parties that are, whether it's Winston Peters or David Seymour or Christopher Luxon, are all showing that kind of disdain for that kind of advice. And the problem with that is if what you're rejecting is just evidence about reality, then that's burying your head. And reality has a habit of kind of whacking you in the arse on the way out. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You don't,
Whacking you. I mean, you're mixing metaphors here, or one
I
of
am.
them is. Yeah, I'm
I think it's
biting,
me.
and you're doing the don't let the door smack you on the ass on the way out. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but yeah, so it is quite, particularly when it comes to things like climate change. I mean, when in that space, Mother Nature does not compromise. She does not negotiate. She just, if you exceed her boundaries for too long, she will just shake you up like fleas from a dog. So there's no.
You've gone metaphor mad. This is fantastic.
I thought you'd enjoy that. So there's no gain in the long run in ignoring reality. Like, you have to deal with the world the way it is.
Well, as Michael Gove once said famously, just ahead of Brexit, and he was in favour of Brexit, of course, which was, I think you'll find this country's had enough of experts. Yeah. And Catherine, there was another issue which is kind of related in a way that you wanted to bring up about the reporting on climate change and how that's changed.
Yeah, so there was a seminar or a get together of people at AUT to discuss the climate change coverage in a changed media world, basically, and currently, and quite an interesting panel discussion and some reporting on it, where they were basically talking about how, at the moment, I think we have one sole journalist in New Zealand, Eloise Gibson, who is a full-time climate reporter within mainstream media. So we have other reporters that cover climate change, and they cover it very well, but they're not just focused on climate change, they're focused on broader issues. And also talking about the general discourse and the way that it has changed since the change in government.
Which is what, Catherine?
The general discourse.
Yeah. Well, what's changed? What is the change?
So in that article, they were comparing some of the comments that James Shaw used to make about the challenge ahead of us and reducing emissions by 45% by 2030 with the kind of things that we get at the moment. And the example that they used was a quote from Shane Jones, who said, "We're not going to be guilt-tripped by these fanciful accounts that the planet is boiling. We need New Zealand's natural resources." So that's another way of saying that.
We've talked a little bit before about missing James Shaw, which is something I never thought I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, his depth of knowledge around climate change issues was
I'm being mean. It's completely unfair.
So and also talking about the way that so the discourse in New Zealand around the change of government, the influence from Trump, and the discourse that comes out of the US, and also just the general doldrums that the media is in, and the reduction in resources that they have, and the loss of journalists that they have, meaning that the coverage just isn't there the way that it used to be, and that is problematic. If they were saying that we went through a few years where there was a real effort to make it part of the everyday conversation and to talk about it a lot across,
and part of every ministry as well.
Yeah, and so and there is some effect from that, in that you're getting more mainstreaming of the subject, and that it gets mentioned, across when other subjects are being talked about. But the loss of focus in the media is.
Yeah, well, let's because I think it's actually weirdly related to the way the Treaty of Waitangi used to be embedded in everything we talked about, and climate change is weirdly similar. Catherine, because I have a triumvirate of professors, I'm going to ask you to finish on that one, and we'll welcome these three fabulous professors.
Great.
Thanks, Catherine. We've got a little bit of an echo. If anybody's got their speakers on, please turn them off if you can. It's your echo cancelling, I think, again, Teresa. So let me introduce the three. I mean, our audience has seen two of you before. Jamie Shea is on from Chatham House, or not literally from Chatham House. Jamie, you're a professor at Exeter. Are you in Brussels or somewhere else?
In Brussels, and as
Excellent.
You can see from the backdrop, ensconced in my house.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we've got Professor Robert Patman, our frequent guest on from Otago, and he's kind of instigated this in a way, because Robert is usually our armchair military strategist, but now we've got somebody who was formerly in NATO and is very expert on this. And we also have, for the first time, Professor Teresa Dunworth, who was on from Auckland, who is a professor of international law from Auckland University. And it's a little bit of an extension of last week's discussion where we had Janet Anderson on from the asymmetrical haircuts team reporting from The Hague, and we talked about international law, the ICC, and the destruction, in a sense, or the way the United States is making it very difficult to run the ICC and the ICIJ. But as I mentioned to you guys in a note, I thought we'd start, if you wouldn't mind, with Ukraine. And Jamie, may I start with you? This extraordinary drone attack this week, something like 170 drones. The way that they work coming out of the sort of ceiling, the hidden ceiling of containers, the way they were driven thousands of miles across Russia. I mean, this is a sort of strategic game changer, isn't it, militarily?
Well, I don't necessarily think it's going to change the outcome of the war, frankly, because clearly that's going to be determined either on the battlefield, where the Russians are managing to push ahead a little bit now in the Donbass, albeit with enormous casualties. For example, The Economist this week is reporting that this week will mark the 1 millionth Russian casualty, not on both sides, just on the Russian side, with about 400,000 dead or wounded on the Ukrainian side. So that's really where I think the center of gravity, to use a Bismarckian phrase, is still going to happen, or presumably also at the negotiating table if Trump is able to get Zelensky and Putin together with him and try to cut some kind of a deal. But it does, of course, boost Ukrainian morale tremendously. By showing that they have the capacity to fight back. And it's significant strategically, yes, in the fact that it has inflicted serious military damage on Russia, but by either destroying or at least hurting very badly the Russian strategic air force. I mean, NATO sources yesterday were saying about 40 strategic bombers, many of them carrying cruise missiles, were hit in these strikes. That's about 30% of Russia's total sort of strategic bomber force. So it still has 70% left. But yes, it's
and some of them were. I noticed drone footage today, Jamie, that showed that several of them. I mean, we're talking about the famous Tu-95, the propeller-driven bear, as you would have called it when you were at NATO, and that, not to turn myself too much into a pipe-smoking armchair general, and the Tu-22, the swing-winged bomber, a bit like the F-111.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's happened is that Ukraine in the past was trying to attack these airfields from Ukrainian territory with drones that could fly over thousands of kilometers. For example, in the past, they've managed to hit an ammunition factory at Omsk in Siberia, about 3,000 miles away. So they've demonstrated this capacity. But of course, when you're launching drones from Ukraine, the Russians have got plenty of time to track these and to shoot them down, as they've been doing, for example, over Moscow. So the Ukrainians had to come up with something different, really, this time round to have an impact and to take the Russians by surprise. And this Trojan horse, literally this Trojan horse strategy of sort of sending these trucks loaded with sort of fake mobile homes into Russia, but hiding, of course, these drones and then releasing them only at the very last minute, very close to the airfields, has made them so much more effective. So yes, it's a coup for the Ukrainians, but it had to be prepared over 18 months. You recall, for example, a couple of years back, we had this Israeli strike against the beeper phones of the Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon, which did a lot of damage. But you could see that these sort of operations take a lot of time, a lot of preparation, a lot of effort. You can't pull them off every 5 minutes. So there is, of course,
I guess, though, Jamie, I was just thinking when I was asking about. Forgive me. When I was asking about the strategic aspect, it was really about, we've just had a UK defence review which talked about being, quotes, battle ready, which I thought was a load of old bollocks, but you may disagree. We've had a similar one in New Zealand with even less money put behind it. The idea of sending a couple of $1,000 drones to destroy $7 billion worth of aging nuclear-capable aircraft must force a really extraordinary rethink about what defence posture needs to be.
Well, it certainly does point to sort of growing vulnerability. And for example, already you've had people in the United States associated with Trump's Golden Dome project. Say, ha, we told you so. This is exactly the sort of illustration of this new sort of vulnerability that we're all facing. Drones, covert operations, massive missile bombardment from a country like Russia, which is able to turn out sort of 3,000 new missiles a year. We're vulnerable. So now we've got to do two things. First of all, invest massively in air defense. NATO yesterday, for example, NATO defense ministers, by the way, are meeting today in Brussels, called for a 5-fold increase in air defense assets. It's a little bit like before the Second World War.
Yeah, but were they meaning shotguns and nets? Yeah.
A massive bombardment, yes, and also, of course, we can't be patsies like the Russians in terms of leaving our prized assets naked on an airfield. We've got to start, putting them in hardened shelters.
Well, you would know the answer to this, because I saw just, and before I go, I want to come to Robert in a moment just to prepare you, Robert, about the New Zealand perspective on this, and as well as the risks from a Putin response point of view. Jamie, is it true that one of the reasons those bombers were so visible is that their airports or their aerodromes are all developed according to START, which is no longer valid, the START treaty, so that they actually have to be visible to American and other satellites in order to verify them for non-nuclear purposes?
Well, it's an interesting hypothesis, absolutely. But I think also there is, whether you like it or not, the traditional bureaucratic incompetence. Somebody in the Russian military command obviously has not evaluated this threat seriously, and has also allowed too many bombers to be concentrated in too few air bases. But also it's part of the success of Ukraine, because by creating this sort of threat in the first place, you remember that the Ukrainians struck another strategic Russian air base called Engin, much closer to Moscow 2 years ago, where they also claim to have destroyed a number of aircraft. So what the Russians have done is sort of taken them at a greater distance away, but to make them less vulnerable, concentrated them paradoxically on just a few airfields, and so the Ukrainians,
which are impossible for the Ukrainians to hit because they're too far away.
Exactly, that's the point, hence the Trojan horse tactic of the truck. So to some degree, the Ukrainians have sort of reaped the benefit of some of their earlier attacks here. So yes, I think there could be a START implication, but I think simply, as always, bureaucratic incompetence in not foreseeing the threat is probably the main reason.
Yeah, Robert, you messaged me in quite a sort of Bigglesish excited way about the elaborate nature of this, and I felt exactly the same way with the roof coming off and and particularly with the containers blowing up later. What do you see as the implications of this? And if it's not too much of a stretch for you, what are the implications for New Zealand's Defence Review?
Well, like Jamie, I think it's a significant development. I think there's three major implications. Firstly, is big implications for the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. There's been a very dominant narrative for the last 18 months that Russia was slowly but inexorably imposing its power. Russia has enormous advantages, manpower and also military capability on Ukraine. I think that narrative has been somewhat undermined because asymmetrical warfare, great power, as we've said before, great powers can and do get defeated. The United States in Vietnam, Soviet Union, Afghanistan, the United States didn't prevail in Iraq. And Ukraine has certainly got a lot of motivation. Also, I think Ukrainians, it's not just asymmetrical in military terms, what they're pursuing. I think Zelensky is very attuned to the political situation in Moscow. This is a disastrous position for Mr. Putin. As usual, he went missing for a while, but he's now come back vowing vengeance. His position, what's interesting is that Zelensky piled it on psychologically by saying, oh, this is just the beginning. And of course, in the last 24 hours, we heard about the attack on the Kerch Bridge, but also they're piling it on. They're now attacking, apparently hundreds of drones have attacked Rostov, which was, one of the major springboards for the invasion of Ukraine. So I do think it's changing the narrative somewhat.
So presumably, Robert, they've had the capacity.
Russia looks much more vulnerable after this than many Western analysts have been saying for the last 18 months. A lot of people are saying, oh, Ukraine can't ever win. We have to give up. Ukraine has to have a land for peace deal. I think that's become much more, I think that's become more contestable now. I think the second big implication, which you guys, Jamie and yourself, Peter, have already drawn on, it has big implications. Ukraine, according to some strategic analysts, already has a significant lead in drone technology globally. And if you watch the American commentary, I'm not just talking about people who were sort of pro-Russian. I'm talking about people who are quite pro-Ukrainian. There was I think a hint of almost irritation that a small country could pull off something like this. You know, great powers like to pride themselves on their military invulnerability and their prowess militarily. And I think this is a bit of a shock. It shows that smaller powers in the interconnected world we live in can actually get a significant lead in an important technology for war and conflict.
And Robert, before I go back to Jamie to ask him about the Putin threats, just what do you think the implications are given the New Zealand
for New Zealand? I think
emphasis on drones
when New Zealand had its big defence statement not so long ago, there was very little mention about the importance of drones. And I do think New Zealand should be doing more to support Ukraine. I mean, let's be quite clear about this. For countries like Britain, which has a veto in the UN Security Council, of course Britain stands for a rules-based international system, unlike the Trump administration, by the way, at the moment. But if you take a country like New Zealand, and most small and middle powers which don't have that perk of a veto on the Security Council, they are very dependent on a rules-based order. Rules are there for the weak, not the strong. And I think, you know, given that, and given that Mr. Putin is invading, you know, lots of people use this term war, what we're witnessing is an attempted annexation. And Mr. Putin's terms for a settlement are annexation terms. They're not a peace settlement.
Yeah. Well, and I'll come back to the Security Council.
To sum up, I think New Zealand should be incentivised to increase its support. Sorry.
No. Forgive me, but Teresa, I'm assuming that in your case, your main area of expertise is going to be about Gaza rather than Ukraine, because somebody's just accused me of ignoring the woman again, which of course I wouldn't dream of doing.
I'm not sure you're ignoring the woman because you're asking me a question now, but
correct.
Hello, and thank you very much for the invitation to come on. So my interest is in the legal aspects, not the military strategy, or I'm definitely not an armchair general. And from a legal point of view, I think that the Ukrainian the Gaza situation isn't actually that interesting legally. Obviously, the humanitarian catastrophe is important, but there is no space to argue about are Israel's actions legal or not legal. Where the Ukrainian situation is concerned, I was struck today by one of the commentators from the United States comparing this to the bleeper attacks that Jamie mentioned a little while ago. From a legal point of view, they're completely different. So the drone attacks here was a military target. Now, in my sort of superficial searching, I haven't seen any accounts of any human casualties, whether they're civilian or military, but it's fair and square a lawful target. It might be very interesting from a military point of view, but from a legal point of view, in my point of view, it's fair and square a lawful target. Whereas the bleeper attacks, the best you could say from the bleeper attacks is that they were indiscriminate, but it possibly could go as far as to say that they were direct attacks, because it was so obvious that civilians and family members would be killed or injured from it. So on a legal point of view, they're not comparable at all. And in terms of, I just wanted to say something about the bridge,
the Kerch Bridge.
Again, from a legal point of view, it's much more questionable as to whether that was a lawful attack or not.
Really? Why? Well, do explain that one. That's brilliant. Thank you, because I hadn't thought about that.
So the bridge, clearly it's used, it's symbolically important, right? And clearly it is a supply route for military equipment. And so that gives it a military tag on it. But I don't know enough about that bridge, maybe Jamie does, to know whether it's also used for,
Oh, yes.
civilian purposes. So it's what we might call then dual use infrastructure, right? And if it's dual use infrastructure, so like we've seen in other wars, bridges in the NATO bombing in Yugoslavia, we see television studios, we see Israel bombing ports in the Lebanon. So these are all dual use, and so therefore, as soon as there's even some kind of a civilian kind of mixed into it, then we're back into our proportionality rules again.
I was really struck. It's not struck. It's probably been obvious, but and I'm going to ask you a question and then come to Jamie. Vladimir Putin described it as an act of terrorism, which is in a sense understandable, even if bogus, because it's so far from the battlefield. What happens if they attack Moscow next time, Teresa?
It'll depend on where in Moscow. If it's downtown Moscow, then it's a war crime. It's a deliberate or certainly an indiscriminate attack on civilians. So it would depend. But terrorism is a word that's bandied about as a political term. As a legal concept, it's difficult to know how you would describe that as terrorism. Legally speaking, political aims, yes, it is, but it's not at a civilian population. So the bridge has plausible
Thank you.
military advantage, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Jamie, how concerned should we be by the bellicosity and inevitable bellicosity to some extent of Putin's response, his hour and a bit conversation with Trump overnight, in which Trump says he threatened revenge, I think, or certainly retaliation?
Well, obviously, you could expect this to happen. I mean, when I heard the readout of the call between Trump and Putin yesterday, I was really, aghast that, Trump sort of was serving as Putin's spokesperson. I used to be a spokesperson, so I know about this job, saying, well, I'm just going to tell you what Putin told me. Well, President Trump, what message did you send to Putin? What was the purpose of the call? What were you trying to achieve? What was your strategy for getting Putin to Istanbul for peace talks? Trump said, well, I didn't think, peace was any closer. It was a very sort of low octane, low energy sort of call.
He didn't sound like an engaged party as the leading party in NATO.
No, exactly. I'm just going to tell you, for your information, thank me for it, what Vladimir told me. So, he did a much better job of getting Putin's message out to an international audience than Putin could have ever done himself. I think, the American diplomacy really needs to take a second look at that. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. No, of course, Putin has to respond, as Robert was saying, and we were saying it's been a big sort of humiliation for Putin, with so many strategic bombers being damaged or lost, and of course the publicity, the propaganda boost that Ukraine has got from this. So Putin obviously, is under pressure domestically to do something. The thing from the Ukrainian point of view is that what can Putin do to you more than what he's doing already? For example, the Russians, before this happened, this attack on the airfields, have sent, a Resnik ballistic, nuclear capable, although fortunately not carrying a nuclear warhead, but attacked Ukraine with these weapons. But even before this Ukrainian action, the Russians launched their biggest ever nighttime attack on Ukraine with over 400 drones. 400 drones in one single attack, plus a mix of missiles. They've adopted a quite overt strategy of targeting civilian infrastructure, been attacking the energy grid. So sort of short of, a salvo of ballistic missiles, hopefully conventional, or even the use of a tactical nuclear weapon is what they've been threatening in the past. I don't think they'll go that far, but from a Ukrainian point of view, you could say yes, okay, they're going to retaliate, but we've been facing pretty much all-out war already. So what more can Russia do? So yes, but obviously within the next couple of days, probably there will be something, and I can imagine it will be an attack which will involve a larger number of sort of hypersonic missiles, Iskanders, more Oresniks.
And would you imagine it would have
those
absolutely no? I mean, just to Teresa's point about military targets versus civilian. And of course, so people are asking on the feed, whether we'll get to the Israel story, the Gaza and Israel story, and we will in just a minute. We'll just try and segment these a little bit. Jamie, would you expect that Russia will be disciplined about attacking military targets?
It's not disciplined at all. I mean, the Russians are playing a little bit the Israeli playbook and vice versa, where they always claim that they're attacking a military target. If they attack a restaurant, which they kill people, which they've done in Kharkiv in the past, or attacks on Kherson or other towns. Sumy at the moment seems to be the one that's coming under bombardment. Every time it's, that the commanders were meeting in the basement, similar to the Israeli narrative that, under every hospital there's or school, because the Israelis have been attacking schools in Gaza recently, there's a Hamas command post. And therefore, unfortunately, collateral damage, in inverted commas, is inevitable, because that's the only way to get at these Hamas targets, or to get at the Ukrainians secretly meeting in the basement, and that this is just an unfortunate reality of war. But they never provide evidence on either side to show that there really was a Ukrainian command post or a Hamas command post. We see the reality of the civilian casualties much more than the military casualties.
Yeah.
And again, from a NATO perspective, they're taking an enormous risk because, instead of minimizing the risk to harm to civilians, going along with the Geneva Conventions, the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1947, they're accepting a maximum risk, almost the inevitability.
Yeah.
So
let's leave that because we get to Gaza.
Hamas,
Yeah.
yeah,
let's leave that. We'll just move to, because I want to ask.
It's inevitable that 20 or 30 innocent Palestinians are being killed. So unfortunately, you get a situation where the entire civilian population becomes an enemy combatant in a kind of way, and bears the same sort of vulnerability or accountability to attack as the sort of the bad guys, if you like, the armed forces that you're trying to attack. I think this is a terrible slippage in international law and military ethics, and it's a very bad signal for future wars. I mean,
that's a very good segue for me to go to Robert for a moment, and then
NATO spokesman in Kosovo, which was referred to quite rightly. There was also mistakes, but they were really mistakes. They were, in the sense that, not, confusing the Chinese embassy for a Yugoslav defense ministry supply facility. I mean, that was silly, yes, obviously, but it was a mistake.
It was a. Do we used to call those a snafu?
Well, yes, big time. And I'm not sort of denying the responsibility that you take. But what I'm saying is that what I remember in Kosovo was the sheer frustration of our military commanders, who were not allowed by the politicians to attack 90% of the targets that they had on their list, precisely because intelligence agencies calculated that the risk of this kind of accidental harm to civilians was far too great. So it was, I think, a different era from what we're seeing, unfortunately, now.
Robert, let me come to you on the strategic aspect of this, or the diplomatic strategic act. And just to also just explain to everybody, one of the reasons that I'm nominating people is not to ignore Teresa or anybody else. It also helps Simon with the echo on the line. Robert, it's kind of interesting that I assume that this attack by the Ukrainians could have been launched on a much greater window. They chose to do it during, I think, the second of these Istanbul talks. Jamie makes the point how extraordinary it is that Trump sort of describes the Putin call in an almost disinterested way, and I say disinterested in the way of judges. What do you think of the sort of strategic aspect of this in terms of the diplomatic negotiations between Moscow and Kiev, and the sort of diplomatic position of Kiev?
It's a very good question, and we now know that the Russians, some of those planes that were hit, were actually loaded with cruise missiles in an operation called Zeus Lightning, and that was part of an imminent attack that the Russians were preparing on the eve of the first meeting in Istanbul of the second round, of course, talks. And in a sense, it was almost a preemptive attack by the Ukrainians, given that, to use Mr. Trump's phrase, those planes, some of them were locked and loaded with cruise missiles, which were destined for a massive attack on Ukraine. So that was an interesting aspect to this. And I fully take on board what Jamie said earlier, that this operation was 18 months in the works, and they're not the sort of thing you can put together at the drop of a hat. But what was interesting is what we know from the Ukrainians, it was 18 months in the works, but the timing, they probably had some discretion when they launched this attack.
Yes.
And they have seemed to have very good intelligence. What is really destabilizing, well, that's too strong a term, what's unsettling the Putin government at the moment is that many Russian citizens made this operation possible. Truck drivers, people who rented premises where these stuff was, these drones, 117 of them was stored. So that's very interesting itself. The strategic implications, I mean, with the risk of repetition, I think they're quite significant. And it seems to me that the Ukrainians may feel they've got a bit of momentum, but I think the Ukrainians, I think a lot of their strategy is designed to put maximum pressure on Putin. I mean, one of the interesting things is, if you look at some of the Ukrainian commentaries since of course, it's quite elated and triumphalist almost, but they're also saying, will we have another Yevgeny Prigozhin moment in the not too distant future? Because, one of the difficulties for a strongman leadership of an authoritarian state is that they accept that Putin and his gang, basically have disproportionate economic wealth compared with the rest of the population. But many Russians, I think it's a third of Russians don't have indoor toilets. There's terrible inequality in that country. And there's been terrible casualties as a result of the catastrophic invasion of Ukraine. And it seems to me this is an explosive mixture because, while you're keeping the war away from Russia, maybe people will just put up with it because they know the consequences of speaking out. At one point, people were getting imprisoned for 15 years, apparently, if they called it an invasion, of course, what it was. But it seems to me that this is a dangerous moment for Putin. He's got to retaliate, and he's got to do it forcefully. But that won't stop challenges to him because it's no secret that senior retired military people warned in mid-February that an invasion of Ukraine would be catastrophic in mid-February 2022. And that was actually public knowledge. I mean, the American Russian specialist, Peter Rutland, published on this stuff, that there were senior Russian retired officers warning not to invade Ukraine. So there's certainly unrest amongst some ranks of the military. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Robert, and I think one of the, I wouldn't be surprised if we're in for a period of unrest because there's a fair amount of backbiting and recriminations going on in Moscow at the moment. They're not being aired in public, but you can bet your bottom dollar they're going on.
Robert,
because this was a humiliating
very briefly
experience.
To Jamie for one specific question I want to ask before I move to Teresa. Jamie, difficult question, but we saw just how much the Americans shared intelligence before the invasion and have obviously shared targeting information. Do you think that the Americans might have been involved in sharing intelligence that helped this attack?
I'm not sure, which I know is not a great answer, but it's an honest one.
I expect you to know everything, Jamie.
Well, no, but there is an aspect here which I think we should mention.
Mm.
And of course, what Robert says is what I really want to believe also about the future of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Although I think Putin, on the other hand, is sort of counting on American disengagement, Ukraine's recruiting problems, fatigue in Ukraine more generally, the desire of people now to get to some kind of peace, to give him some kind of advantage. So I think he still thinks he can win, despite perhaps, mounting domestic pressures. And I don't personally think that yet Ukraine is able to inflict enough damage on Russia through these strikes to really change the calculus on the battlefield, which is what I said earlier. There are things that boost the morale, and there are things that ultimately are decisive war-winning factors. But I think on your question, I think what's really worried the Trump administration, and this was expressed by the Ukraine envoy, General Keith Kellogg, yesterday, is the fact that these are nuclear capable assets. And the Biden administration, you remember when it was reluctant to give Ukraine, HIMARS and ATACMS and long-range artillery a year or so ago, was very worried that these would be used, to attack nuclear facilities, and this would really provoke Russia. Now, of course, there's probably a big difference between, attacking a Russian nuclear silo somewhere directly,
Yes.
and causing some kind of nuclear explosion, and attacking a nuclear-capable bomber, but which happens to be carrying cruise missiles and is not in a nuclear role. But clearly, the Americans are queasy about all of this at the moment. So, contrary to what you're suggesting, dear sir, it could go the other way. That instead of facilitating, Ukraine's ability to attack these kind of nuclear-capable targets, the Americans will stop doing this entirely, because precisely there would be a danger that Putin would then, consider that the nuclear threshold had somehow been crossed and retaliate. I mean, it's very difficult, to estimate the likelihood of all of this, but I think that what the Ukrainians are trying to do now, both in terms of working without the American supply of weapons, ramping up their domestic production, using their own intelligence, is really to develop much more an autonomous operational capability, precisely because they can't rely upon this American intelligence as they did in the past. It was already pulled away for a couple of weeks, you remember, when Trump was unhappy with Zelensky. So they're looking for workarounds. And as Robert said, or you said, but clearly they've got good domestic sources of intelligence inside Russia. I mean, they've demonstrated this not only through these drone strikes, but the targeted assassinations. They've bumped off a number of prominent Russian commanders and generals and so on, including the head of the chemical, biological, radiological weapons unit. Using scooter bombs and all of this. There's a lot of ingenuity here.
Yeah, as a proud owner and user of a scooter, I get nervous every time I get on it. Teresa, let me come to you, please.
Check it out before you get on it, right?
Yes. Jamie, I'm much more likely to just fall off it, I think, after a few drinks, particularly. Teresa, I want to come to you, please, because Jamie talked about the international law concept. I'm going to use what we sometimes do in the show as a segue. The international law implications of where we're getting to in Gaza seem rather extraordinary. You've written a lot about this. And I am going to, people get a bit toey sometimes if I try to balance things out. At some point in our conversation, I hope to read out the list of IDF people who've been killed in the last 3 or 4 days. But it is, because I was wondering whether anything was coming the other way. But it is a tiny number of people, but it is an important thing to remember that there is retaliation of sorts going on. What's your sense of the climate from an international law position of what's going on in Gaza right now, where we're seeing Israel and the United States cooperate to use aid as a device, as it were?
So first of all, let me come back on the IDF deaths.
Yes.
While I would not rejoice in anybody's death, whether they're an IDF person or an Israeli civilian or a Palestinian civilian, actually IDF personnel are lawful targets. Israel is, by its own admission, is at war, and this is their defense force. So just to put that on one side.
Thank you.
So in terms of the aid and the shooting, Israel appears to be making up international humanitarian law on the hoof to say that they said that the corridor to the food is a military strategic area, or they had some expression, and that therefore anybody who moved into it got targeted or was a lawful target. That's just simply, that's just so not what the reality of the law is. So first of all, you can't just declare that there's food here and you're starving and your children are starving. And by starving, I don't mean it as a rhetorical device. I mean that they're dying. Children and adults are dying. And so you're not going to be reasonable. It's like you've been thrown off a ship. You're not going to behave rationally when you're trying to save your children or yourself. It's the same thing with the food. So that's just not even a thing. But even if it was a thing, even if you are in a military zone and you're clearly a civilian, then you can't be targeted, right? So the whole aid thing, I mean, it comes back to UNRWA, right? And the distrust of the
we've had
United
Helen
Nations
Clark on
process.
several times talking about that as well, this distaste
Yes,
for
that's exactly
UNRWA
right.
and the UN.
Because why would you put people in an organization that has, to my knowledge, zero experience in an extremely dangerous and fraught situation? It's not humanitarian. It's the exact opposite of that.
Yeah. Jamie, you wrote a very interesting piece for your Friends of Europe on the Friends of Europe site that you contribute to, and I just to get you all into this, I'm getting criticism from some of our viewers, and I do understand that by mentioning the IDF deaths, I'm trying to bring even-handedness when, that we have to just call this genocide. But it's not my job I'm not trying to bring in both sidesism. But I'm also trying to explain what's actually going on when I don't have all of the resources to bring to bear on it. But Jamie, you made a point in quite a long piece. I don't mean it's over long, about the damage
you can say that. I'm not offended.
Not at all. Not at all. The damage that Israel is doing to its reputation, its standing in the world, and its likely level of support in the future. I think. Would you like to explain those kind of what you were trying to get across with that?
Well, I think yesterday you had an indication of this. You had this vote in the UN Security Council for an unconditional ceasefire. The US vetoed it, but a lot of countries in Europe, Denmark, a non-permanent member, but UK, France, permanent members on the council, and everybody else, 14 others, all voted for the resolution. Nobody abstained. So it was only the US veto that prevented that, at least from being adopted, even if Israel might have disregarded it, as Theresa said, the relations between the UN and Israel at an all-time low. I mean, we've had in my country, the UK, this week, 700 prominent lawyers writing a letter to the government, calling for a firmer stance, for example, arms embargoes and this kind of thing as well. So I think, opinion pressure internationally is mounting. The Gaza situation, I imagine, in New Zealand as well, is getting a great deal of coverage on the media. The real problem, of course, is twofold. I mean, or three things. I mean, first of all, Netanyahu is so far in at the moment after nearly 2 years of war, with his coalition pressures, so committed to a military solution that you get to the point in wars where leaders can't turn back any longer and have to be sort of stopped by other means, whatever they are. Number two, of course, the United States is remaining solid and supplying Israel with all of the weapons that allow it to continue this kind of activity. And number three, even we in Europe sort of complain all of the time and want some sort of resolution, but we're not taking firm action. For example, yesterday, interestingly, the Israeli Defense Ministry published a report that last year it sold more Israeli weapons to more countries than it's ever done before. Its defense sales are booming. Only Spain, as far as I can see, among EU countries, here in Brussels has been willing to cancel some of the contracts that it has with Rafale, an Israeli defense company. The Germans, who traditionally have supported Israel for obvious historical reasons, the CDU, CSU parliamentary majority in the government had a vote yesterday in which they said, no, we're not going to take any action. We're going to complain, but we're not going to stop the rather considerable German arms supplies to Israel as well. So, outrage is fine as always, but where is that kind of decisive pressure going to come from in the military or commercial area, which could really sort of, stop this from becoming worse? I mean, how hellish can, as the Director General of the Red Cross told the BBC yesterday, how hellish can hell
Can it get? Yeah, I just also so again, I'm going to come to you, Teresa, because you just about had a conniption when Jamie said that in a moment, whereas Robert was calm and collected. So I'll be coming back to Robert about also whether New Zealand ought to recognise Palestine or what its tactics need to be. But also and this has happened before. Some of our audience is talking about the minimal coverage of this story in New Zealand. I mean, it is virtually impossible. Well, it is impossible for any international media to get into Gaza. They can, to some extent, get into the West Bank. So, let's not attack the New Zealand Herald or the Sun, whatever the stuff and so on. You've got access to Haaretz, you've got access to the Guardian, BBC. I took the Israel Institute, who I think are odd, to task today for publishing a cartoon to the New Zealand audience of the main broadcasters closing their eyes and their ears and everything to this story when it was the Houthis and Hamas and Hezbollah. It's not the case. Teresa, what was the thing?
I do apologise for butting in, everybody, but
not in the slightest.
I have to sign off and unfortunately drop off. But thank you again.
It is so good to please don't drop off. I mean, drop off the call, but please don't drop off more importantly. All right. It's so good to see you again.
Too early in the day for that. No, thanks again, and good to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Teresa, what was the point that caused you to become tiny bit agitated?
So Jamie spoke about the UK letter from 700 lawyers. Actually, I checked it this afternoon, and it's 1,136, and it includes over 100 King's Counsel. It includes 2 former judges of the UK Supreme Court. So this is the bastion of the legal profession in the UK. We see a similar letter in Australia. I haven't done the head counts of it. So just to correct that point, that it's
growing.
There's even in the Iraq War, there was never that rise up from the legal profession. It's belated, in my opinion, but better late than nothing.
Robert, what do you think New Zealand should do in this context?
Well, I think I very much liked Teresa's article in Newsroom recently when she said that New Zealand should be recognising the Palestinian state. And I think we have been equivocating on that issue. And I think the New Zealand position, and Teresa can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it really is that we have to wait till there's peace before we can inevitably extend recognition, because as Mr. Peters said, it's not a question of when, but it's not a question of if, but when. So the government, and to be fair to the New Zealand government, actually it was one of the only Western countries, it broke with the other Five Eyes back in October 27th, 2023, and Ireland were the only 2 countries aligned with the Western world, really, that actually wanted an immediate humanitarian truce, as it was then called. But we haven't really been particularly active outside the UN. And that's the thing that's frustrated me. I think New Zealand, when you raise this issue, what's it got to do with us is the sort of attitude. I think that's wrong. I think New Zealand should show some moral leadership. We like to think of ourselves as a society as giving everyone a fair go. And it's quite clear, I think, through the eyes of most people, that the Palestinians are certainly not getting a fair go. Israel is acting with impunity, and it's doing so with the connivance and complicity of the United States. And this is a disaster both for Israel in medium to long term and for the United States. I think Mr. Biden made an absolutely critical error of judgment when, despite, I think, his private reservations, he gave Israel almost unconditional support.
Total, yeah. Flew,
and
we've talked
and
about
that
this so
he
many
should have
times.
shown
Flew
political
over.
fortitude and said, no, we will only provide aid as long as this is a classic counter-terrorist campaign where you target those responsible, but you protect the civilian population by upholding a humanitarian law. There's never been an attempt to do that. I haven't heard many apologies from the Netanyahu government. Netanyahu does not want a Palestinian state. He makes no bones about it. And that makes American unconditional support even more puzzling, because there are few precedents in history where one great power has given arms to a smaller country, a country of about 10 million people, for purposes which, at least diplomatically, it disapproved of. America, the position of the Biden administration was that it wanted a two-state solution, and yet it continued to arm a government which has consistently denied that possibility.
We might
for the
need a whole
Palestinians.
show on the current status of the two-state solution.
But yeah,
and
Trump's
whether we
moved
just-
again.
Yeah, Robert. Before I ask, I want to ask Teresa another question as well. Again, this is because I'm trying to make sure that none of us speak across each other, because that would never happen on this show. Again, I just want to. So, Catherine Leavitt, the White House spokesman, yesterday attacked the BBC for using what she said, listening to Hamas or using Hamas as a source. I'm really sick and tired of people on the feed and various others attacking the media for their coverage of this, because it is so hard. If you look at what, and again, David Mooring, who's one of our regulars, says there's tons of video. If the BBC or anybody else or CNN is going to run a piece of video, or Reuters is going to run a piece of video out of those incredibly brave people taking video in Gaza, they're going to have to verify it, because there's also crap coming out and just, there's all sorts of disinformation. This is a really difficult task, and I think I would quite like us all, particularly, I'm talking my own game as a former Reuters person and media person. We do a skateboarding dog, which you guys might like to stay on for, because you might quite like it. Teresa, have you got anything you'd like to comment on this whole Gaza question that we've discussed? And I think I can say that, far from wanting to suppress your presence on the show, I wanted you to come on, and you might be a regular. Robert has basically given up lectures to come and do this now.
So I won't make any comment on the media. I do watch, so I track The Guardian and I track Al Jazeera. And it's not just so first of all, it's like what's in the headline. So they have the information, because if Al Jazeera has it and it's verified, then The Guardian can have it. But I don't want to get into, certainly not slamming the New Zealand.
No, and I'm not saying I shouldn't be saying it's perfect either, because I'm not. But yeah,
no,
thank you.
And I know that. What I would like to come back to is the question about what else should New Zealand be doing.
Yes, please.
So I agree with everything that Robert has said, but I would go much further and say it's not a policy option for New Zealand. It's not a diplomatic choice what should happen here. We're not at a buffet table. What is happening is core breaches of international law, some of our most foundational rules: self-determination, annexation, forcible displacement of populations. Everybody has gotten themselves into a big, huge tiz about, is it genocide? Is it not genocide? What exactly did the ICJ say? The only reason that South Africa had to plead genocide is because that was the only route into the ICJ, right?
Yes.
So they had to argue that it was genocide. And then everybody got distracted about that. So let's say that some lawyers decide it's not genocide. Is it okay then? What's happened? No, it's not okay. Do we have legal obligations to do whatever we can to prevent it? Yes, we do. Not diplomacy, legal obligations. what should that look like, I guess, is a good question. Well, you're right, Peter. New Zealand hasn't been doing anything. It gives its vote in the General Assembly, which, I mean, maybe Winston Peters has said in the House that my view on Palestine shows why academics should not be given a voice or shouldn't appear in court. I would say that he clearly doesn't have a proper understanding of the significance of the New Zealand vote on the recommendation to the Security Council for the statehood, because you can't be admitted to the UN if you're not a state.
Yes.
Right? So this is why people are saying, 147 states recognized Palestine. I think that that's a bit blunt, because
They recognise the ambition
they
of
didn't
Palestine.
completely understand what they were, whatever. But so New Zealand is muddled about what the law is, right? And that's inexcusable. The second point I would make about New Zealand is, when it suits them, they always like to talk about, we're rules-based order, we're
Yes.
punching above our weight. Well, punch above your weight and do something more. That's what I would say.
Teresa, thank you so much. And I won't address some of the comments that are coming in. I am aware of what Bellingcat does. So my skateboarding dog is more of a cautionary tale. There is a remarkable piece in the New Yorker this week. We'll put it in the program notes. And it's about a guy called Curtis Yarvin, which many of you may have heard of, who is weirdly a leading light of he's the kind of, I was comparing him in my mind to that Russian guy whose daughter was killed in the Ukrainian attempt to kill him, Alexander Dugin. And he is a sort of Silicon Valley type person, but it seems like he has huge influence over philosophically over J.D. Vance, Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, and Trump himself. And this excellent piece in the New Yorker said that last spring, which I guess is, in the US, April, May last year, Yarvin was talking about the need to expel all Palestinians from Gaza and turning it into a luxury resort. Quotes, "Did I hear someone say beachfront? The new Gaza, developed, of course, by Jared Kushner, is the LA of the Mediterranean, blah, 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 blah." A few weeks later, as we know, Trump, during a press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu, said he wanted to redevelop Gaza as the Riviera of the Middle East. So I think it's well worthwhile thinking about some of the intellectual forces. We know about Project 2025, which is being enacted in front of our very eyes, despite Trump saying during the campaign that he had no knowledge of it and didn't even know the people behind it. They're now running his Office of Budget and Staff. So it's worth thinking about it. So I'm going to say thank you very much to Teresa. Thanks always to Robert. And Teresa, you're now going to be on again, I hope, after we've had a coffee and discussed our common birthdays. So I'm going to say good night and good luck, as George Clooney playing Edward Murrow might have said, which has not put me in either George Clooney or Edward Murrow's league. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Teresa.